lip gloss. Oh, wait, now my dog has jumped on my lap, which is great because she's a good prop, too. And here's Genghis Khan, a parent of apparently 1,000 children. Are you going to try to sell him college savings plans?
Thanks for broadcasting from your hovel.
Coming to you live from my hovel.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Sense and Signal podcast, where we explore leadership and sense-making. I'm one of the co-hosts, Dan TARKER, and I come from the field of higher education, and that's the lens I bring to this conversation. And I'm here with my co-host,
Jodah JENSEN, and I come from the field of product management and product development, and I bring that lens of generation of product to this conversation. And I will actually let you all decide if that's meaningful or not. So.
And we are delighted to have our guest here today, Christina Inge. She is the author of Marketing Metrics, so I had the pleasure of reading, and it's a delightful book that really helped me understand marketing metrics a lot more and become more confident in my understanding of it. And I hope that having her on this podcast helps you with building some confidence with understanding marketing metrics as well. And she is also the owner of Thoughlight, a marketing consultancy in Boston, Massachusetts. So welcome, Christina. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Dan, so much for having me. Jodah, it's great to meet you as well.
You as
Excited
well.
to be here.
Thank you.
So in your book, you provide some nice tools for people to do CEO content research, right? Search engine content research, as far as looking up keywords. So I use that tool, and I'm going to try and find Answer the Public was the one I used. That's a recommendation from your book.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a really cool tool. I definitely advise people to check that tool out. We'll put a link in it in the show notes. But I put in marketing metrics as a search term, and one of the key questions that it produced that I'm going to ask you are, why are marketing metrics important? Because that seems to be something people on the interwebs are asking.
You know, people on the interwebs have been asking that for a while now. And I would say the number one reason you need to care about your marketing metrics is they tell you what's working and what's not so that you can do more of what is working and less of what is not working to make more money at less cost to yourself. And I'll give you an example of that. So let's say you are targeting 2 or 3 different demographics or psychographics as potential customers. You assume, for instance, your target market is millennials or moms or any one of these very broadly defined markets people have. And you don't know which one's more profitable for you because you're not gathering any metrics on how much are they spending, how much does it cost to acquire people in each category as a customer. Are these even the correct categories for us to be targeting, right? And so that's just one small example where using marketing metrics can help you identify the right market for your product or service or your educational institution, and then be able to market to them effectively by knowing what resonates with them. Because that's another thing metrics will do, is tell you what's resonating with your target audience.
What do they value, really, right?
Exactly. What do they value? What's important to them?
And so you've been in this space for quite a bit of time, and I know you have a whole story that you share in your book about how you got to be where you're at now with marketing metrics. And it really is tied to the evolution of the internet and Google and some of those disruptive technologies. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got here, and how Google influenced your evolution as a marketer?
Oh, absolutely. I was working for a major publisher, Elsevier, in the early 2000s. And it was a publishing powerhouse, especially its trade publications at the time, which, obviously eventually fell prey to shifting publishing trends. One of the things we always wanted to know, though, is what kind of content did the readership find most interesting? That was important both on the editorial side among the writers of our different trade publications. They always wanted to know. But it was also important for advertisers. What were the topics on which they should be advertising? What kind of value propositions should they be putting in front of our audience? And I was working in the market research department, and all we could do was conduct surveys back in those days, because that was the default tool, and it was
or focus groups, right?
Focus groups. Oh yes, and the what I always called sandwich parties, basically. No, not on focus groups. I mean, I recommend
nobody will come to a focus group unless you provide them food.
They will not, and some kind of incentive. So, and again, I love focus groups. I recommend them in my book, but it's a slow, laborious, and expensive way to gather data. So one day it turned out that we had this new tool available to ourselves called Google Analytics, and that allowed you to watch in real time the data without having to ask anybody of what were people reading on the website, what articles, what were they clicking on, what ads were they clicking on. And suddenly you went from having to ask people directly in a complicated way, what do you want us to write about, to being able to see, oh, this is what they're reading on the website. Because someone picks up a magazine, you don't know what articles they're reading. And before Google Analytics, you did not know what pages people were looking at, where they were geographically, what time of day, how long they stayed on the page, none of that. And so being able to gather that data, when I became aware of that in the early 2000s when Google Analytics first came on board, I was ecstatic. And I thought, I knew then my life had changed when I saw that. I mean, I know that's a big oversell, it sounds like, for a piece of software, but it's a whole industry. I knew then that I wanted to do this and that this was going to be my passion in life. And here I am, all these years later, still as excited as that day I found out that this was now a possibility thanks to this emerging tool. And there's now many other such tools, and there were at the time too, but it just, again, absolutely changed everything for me.
So what? So the very fact that you could dive into the numbers in a way that was hyper analytical for you, I think, is what I'm hearing, where you're getting some data that is high fidelity. What is it of that? Why is that so interesting to you? And I'm not saying I'm unclear about why high fidelity of data is important, but why is it? Why is the importance important? What is it what are you trying to drive? What are you hoping to gain by this sort of leveraging of this information?
Well, a couple of things. So I'm going to now, I often like to use, as my past students and current students will tell you, crazy historical analogies, because again, you guys are lucky you're
we
getting
love those.
This is my second interview of the day.
Especially if it's about Rasputin. I love Rasputin stories.
Okay, I do not have a Rasputin story for you. I cannot do the Rasputin dance, but this one, I promise you, it involves equally maybe aggressive persons. So back in the day when I started out in marketing, which was like late 90s, I graduated from college in 1998, actually. Let me just come out and say it. Mm-hmm. Everything, and for a long time, even when we could have done better, everything was demographic targeting, right? Our target audience is suburbanites in their 30s or 40s, right? And so I often, and here I come with my historical analogy, I say, and these are all companies that I have worked with either in classroom case studies, in my teaching, or with real clients, although I can't always name names. Let's say you are, I've got props on my desk too, because you're catching me when
I'm
at maximum awkward at this part in the afternoon.
Oh, yeah. Well, don't be surprised.
I don't get less awkward. I get worse.
Wait. Where's my prop?
Jonah's going to dress up now. You see, you're going to make Jonah get dressed up in the sun.
Okay, wait. I didn't want to derail the conversation. Okay, fine. Okay, I cannot outdo that. All I have is lip gloss. All I've got is a lip gloss. Oh, wait, now my dog has jumped on my lap, which is great because she's a good prop too.
We're elevating this conversation to a whole new level. I love it.
This is Tilly, and Tilly is volunteering as Exhibit A. So you might say that our target audience is, let's say, people who travel with their pets. And you're going to think this, right? Or you're going to say we sell lip gloss, so our target audience is teenage girls. Or we are a package tour company. And again, everybody's like calling anyone young millennials for, LGBTQ millennial travelers. Or we are for parents with multiple children. And then I say to my class, okay, so you've got that. We've got 4 demographics that people would target back in my day when I was coming up. Teenage girls, LGBTQ millennials, people with pets, people with a bunch of kids. And then I show them slides. Here's Joan of Arc. She's a teenage girl. You're going to sell her a lip balm? Here's Alexander the Great. He's, about 32 when he died, so that would make him an LGBTQ millennial. Are you going to try to sell him on a package tour to Hawaii? Here is Hannibal crossing the Alps. It's a person traveling with their pets. Is that a spotted dog? No, it's a bunch of freaking elephants. And here's Genghis Khan, a parent of apparently 1,000 children. Are you going to try to sell him college savings plans?
I hear he's my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather also.
He's everybody's, and so is Charlemagne.
You kind of look like him.
When you put the hat on, it really was. And that's when people kind of have that aha moment of like, if I'm going to target people by age, by gender, by basic things like pet ownership, number of kids, identity, it's like you have no idea what they actually wish to buy. And then I'm like, I keep the slides up and I'm like, okay, examine the photos of these 4 individuals closely. Well, photography had not been invented yet. So none of these people had an Instagram because those would have been epic Instagrams, I got to tell you. But especially Hannibal's, oh my God. So I say, what are you noticing these 4 individuals have in common? And people are like, they're people. No, yeah, I get that. Okay. What are they wearing? Armor. Okay, why are they wearing armor? Oh, they're great generals. Bingo, right? Their occupation is warrior. They are not buying package tours to Hawaii. They're not buying lip balm. They do not want your college savings plan, and they sure as heck do not want a fluffy dog bed for their elephants. They might need armor. They might need shields. They might need a nice siege engine. Cannons have not yet been invented, thank goodness. Fatality rates of ancient battles were much lower for that reason. But they are not purchasing the things you have assumed about their demographics. And of course, everybody thinks they're going to sell everything to millennials, right? Or baby boomers. And they're just like, those are their 2. What happened to us in Gen X?
What happened to Gen X? I'm always.
People have forgotten us.
Yeah. No, we've been lumped into the other group that we don't want to be lumped with. So
which one?
No. Gen X, I mean, we're the resilient
I've never
generation.
met a Z or a millennial never refer to me as a boomer. They always are like, "Aren't you a boomer?" I'm like, "No."
There's this thing called X.
There's this thing called
and
X.
We're cooler than the millennials and the boomers.
We wore Doc Martens first.
That's right.
Yeah, I work on a college campus and I wear my Docs still. And I look around, I was like, look at the students and they're wearing their Docs, and I'm like, we started it, man.
We were the OGs. So that is actually a demographic stereotype, right? You're Gen X, you want your docs. Okay, fine. I've just undermined my entire message here. But so when you're doing marketing analytics, you are able to see the thing right in front of you, and you're not like, oh, I'm going to sell this person a fluffy dog bed because he owns animals. You're like, oh, right, that's Hannibal. He needs armor. And so you can see the obvious thing that the obvious purchasing pattern that consumers have in common with each other. And I think I've begun to spread this knowledge far and wide because I give my students this activity where I give them 4 demographics that are literally this off the wall. And I say, create a Google ad to sell this person something. And my students did me very proud this week. They came up with an ad for the Game of Thrones universe of dragon fireproof shields guaranteed or your money back.
Nice.
And I feel my work here is done. But so that's marketing metrics. In the past, we were really looking at people based on what little we could know about them, like they're 30 or they've got a dog or an elephant or whatever. And that
it sounds like what you're saying, if I could reframe it, it sounds like, to use an old hackneyed analogy, though, it sounds like what you're saying, that people weren't able to see the forest for the trees, in a sense, in the data. And that with Google Analytics and big data, you're now able to get a more nuanced picture and actually really see the full scope of an individual rather than these kind of broad categories.
Exactly. And you know what? I think that the thing that's the most telling when I put people through this activity is that I'm literally showing them a slide with 4 people completely armored up and they cannot figure out what they're seeing.
Yeah, they can't see the armor.
And they're like, okay, what do you think they're doing all day? They're warriors. They're not lip balm buyers. And so and it's not even about going from demographics to psychographics, because occupation is a demographic, but it's figuring out what's the salient demographic or psychographic.
So can we pause there real quick? And can you define the difference between demographic and psychographic for our audience?
I'm so glad you asked. So demographics are parts of your personality, lifestyle, or just, I would say, just existence in the world, may I say, that are pretty permanent or outside of your control, right? They aren't necessarily never going to change, but you can't change the year you were born, the generation you're a part of, your income, marital status, zip code. Those are things that change relatively seldom in your life. And they are fairly stable characteristics. And I would go to say that in the modern world, especially in American culture, they are not as definitive of what you do for a living or what you want to buy or what you want to do as they were for past generations, right? As a woman, what I bought myself for my birthday was power tools. No one markets power tools to me.
Right.
And so, we have all these, I hate to go back to the topic of millennials, but everybody wants to market to them. We have all these stereotypes about people born in a specific generation, but they vary widely in age, income, technological sophistication. They're not all 18-year-old Instagrammers. In fact, no millennials are 18 anymore. Yet we call every young person.
They're in their 40s now, right?
They're in their 40s. I'm 46. I am barely older than millennials. And I'm like, when people tell me, we want to reach young people, I'm like, no, you're reaching people who are basically middle-aged too.
Yeah.
And so that's a demographic. I don't want to get too far off topic. It's a very stable personality or lifestyle characteristic that maybe in the past was much more indicative of what you would want to purchase or what you would be doing with your life, but I think is getting more and more decoupled just as society changes to be more individualistic and people having more choices or exercising more options. And I don't think it was ever as deterministic as marketers made it out to be. It was the only data, so we just saw it as definitive. Psychographics are your tastes, your behaviors, and your personalities in the short term. So those are things like deciding to try keto. That's a psychographic. Let me find more props here. Becoming a knitter and wanting giant things of yarn. That's, that's a psychographic. That's something fully within your control. It's, it's not your age, gender, or height. And, you could obviously change, 2 of those things, but changing your hobby is going to be faster, easier, and more likely. They are things that are personal tastes.
Wait, there is no knitters demographic? I thought there was.
See, that doesn't that get to my original point that where you stereotype people? What's your knitter's demographic that you thought there
Right,
was?
exactly. People who go into old, musky, cute houses with wood floors and hang out there and
They have
talk.
cats.
They have cats and they talk about the weather incessantly while they
They like bridge.
knit and they play bridge on the side. And
Well,
and
They
they
have
drink.
Hummels. They own Hummels.
And their alcohol of choice is gin. I don't know. That's
well, I call myself my home the mid-century modern crumbling ruin. I am renovating it, and I do have hardwood floors.
so I wasn't too far off. All right. Yes.
Do you have a cat? Do you have Hummels?
I don't call it a hovel, but I do call it a crumbling ruin.
What about Hummels? The Hummel figurines.
Oh, Hummels! I thought you said it was someone who had lived in a hovel.
No, like they have Hummels. They have like Hummels displayed.
No, because I was like saying, hovel? Yes, check. This is a hovel. I am in the generation that cannot afford good housing.
Where communication is paramount.
Thanks for broadcasting from your hovel.
Coming to you live from my hovel. Okay, so
All right.
that's the difference between demographics and psychographics. Demographics are stuff that people could pretty much tell from looking at you from the outside or from a checkbox form that you would fill out asking for basic facts about you, like the census would ask. The census isn't going to ask, are you a knitter? But they're going to ask, what's your gender and how many kids have you got?
Okay, so my next question is starts off with itself an apocryphal story, which I think has been disclaimed as being true, or if not exactly said this way, but the famous line that supposedly Ford had said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So my question around this is, can this effort of analytics, can it also potentially, I don't want to use the word misdirect. Can it miss opportunities, or are there opportunities missed? Whereas if you're using analytics to follow a group as opposed to lead a group, or perhaps identify something that they wouldn't, that you wouldn't necessarily normally identify with that group, is there a possibility that the analytics can be limiting in this area, or can it be leveraged to actually forecast things that, like the iPhone, right? Who's the demographic for the iPhone before they launched it? Maybe they had one, I don't know. Or who was the psychographic? Maybe it was derived from that.
I think it can be, and I cannot begin to tell you. Listen, if I had a nickel, and again, revealing how old I am, that I know the word nickel and I use it. If I had a nickel for every time someone has quoted that Henry Ford thing to me of like, people don't know what they want because Henry Ford said this thing,
it's right at this time.
I'd probably be able to afford a ball of yarn only, but it's been often. And it's in the analysis. It's not the data. I think when people look at the data, it goes again to what I talked about of going into, yes, you can look at demographics, but figure out what's the demographic that's relevant. Interpret the data, right? Because if you just throw all the data at the wall to keep my geeky historical analysis going, you're seeing, somebody who's 30, somebody who's 18, somebody who's French, somebody who's Greek, and you think, oh, this is relevant to my armor selling company. Because you're looking at it all, and then you start to develop these weird things of targeting of like, oh, well, French women want this kind of armor. And you're like, no, just Joan of Arc wanted this kind of armor. And so you start to lose, again, the forest for the trees if you just look at this giant fire hose of data and try to use it for prognosticating without being smart about analysis. Number one, people do tell you what they need. They just don't tell you the solution. So what problem did the iPhone solve? It solved problems we knew we had before we got iPhones. Things like, I have to go back to my desk to get work done, and therefore feel tied to my desk on a nice day. It solved problems like I'm waiting for this important message from a client. I cannot leave my office. Those were problems
I'm
that if you sat down, people would tell you they have that problem.
Yeah, and I took a wrong turn in Albuquerque, and now I'm in Toledo.
Yeah, we all have
But that
those
wasn't an iPhone
problems.
solution, right? That was a Garmin solution initially, right? So, I
Right.
mean, just so it sounds to me, it definitely is a great way of framing the problem space. We'll agree
It's
on all that, or no?
yes.
Okay.
It's so to keep with the. I know you had another half of your question though.
No, that was it. It was. Did I have another half of my question? No, I'm just kind of thinking about this notion of how far can analytics be used to um, identify the needs. And I was wondering if there was a gap there that we might miss opportunities. But I think you respond. I mean, I think I agree with your take on that initially. But does it also jump into beyond the problem space? Does analytics go beyond that? And then I guess that would be my now recent follow-up question. Um, Mark Twain said, "What do you say? Lies, damn lies, and statistics."
Oh, statistics, yeah.
I
Yeah,
think that
yeah,
was
yeah.
Benjamin Disraeli.
Okay, all right. So
Okay.
I also heard of Scooby Doo at one time, so I don't know who
It
said
could
it,
have
but
been anybody, Abraham Lincoln,
yeah,
whatever.
right.
Yeah.
So it was Ford. I think Ford said it. But what? And I think analysis is the crux of the problem here, right? And when I say problem, I mean problem as in a platonic problem. How does one wrangle that process? So you've collected all this data. It's in
How
the
do you find
tell.
the patterns?
How do you find the
Use the
patterns?
term. You use the term in your book, data mining, right? Like to
Yeah.
dig into the pattern, dig into the data to find those patterns. What does that look like?
So data mining is if you have a large enough data set, you can use predictive analytics, you can use machine learning to look for patterns in the data that you are not imposing your preconceived notions onto. So I hear you, Jodah, about the fact that if we keep looking at the data, we come to everything with our own preconceived set of notions. And so we are going to have confirmation bias. We're going to see that data through our own lens. And share possibly also apocryphal story to just keep my four protagonists going here in my analogy. Apparently, at one point, Alexander the Great freaked out because he had run out of world to conquer. He thought he had gotten to the end of the world. People literally did think there was an end of the world, and if you kept going, you would fall off, and there were turtles holding the planet up.
Wait
And
a
so
second.
that
That's
was,
not true.
Yeah, wait.
it's
That's
not
not true.
true.
Hold on a second
Oh
here.
crap!
It's actually badgers. And people believed
That makes
that.
more sense, actually.
Yeah, no, it totally makes more sense. And so people thought that. They literally thought there was a known world and you were going to come to the end of it. Now what am I going to do? I'm 30 years old. I've conquered everything. The next thing is the badgers holding up the planet, and then I fall off. What am I going to do? Well, then who comes along and proves the earth is round? It's not kings, it's not emperors, empresses, it's not the Roman Empire, it's not Alexander the Great, it's not Hannibal, it's us dorks who are the scientists, the explorers, the astronomers. We figure out the earth is round. There's plenty more world. Now, unfortunately, the result of that is tragic because once you find more world to conquer, some so-and-so is going to come around and colonialize it. Thank goodness Alexander thought he was going to fall off the edge of the earth because the people who thought that they weren't used that for evil. And well, anyway, I'm not going to get into that part of history right now. But you see, it was people from other disciplines who finally figured out, you know what, the earth is actually round. You can't run out of earth. It's a circle. You're not going to fall off the edge. And so what I say to people in marketing is, if you are a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. If you are just a marketer, everything's going to look like a SWOT analysis or a value proposition or a new audience to go prospecting into. So If you're using small data, so you do not have a large enough data set to do any kind of data mining, you can't do any predictive analytics, you can still get your UX people in there, your finance people, your HR people. You can get your creative team who doesn't normally look at the data because they don't care about it, even within your own marketing team. But what you need is fresh brain power. There was a study conducted, and it's in the Harvard Business Review, that teams with more cognitive diversity, different thinking styles, solve problems faster and more accurately. And the more groupthink there is within a group and the more people think alike, the more people are going to fail to solve problems. So, you're some guy with a shield, you surround yourself with other warriors, you're all just going to think, must conquer land over there. You get a philosopher in, and he's going to look at things from a different perspective. Now, again, this is putting aside the tragic uses in real life history greater knowledge has often led to. However, we've also managed as a species to invent antibiotics, electricity, Wi-Fi, tacos. So knowledge
Tacos.
That's
tacos.
an invention? I thought there was an emergent. Yeah.
So you need to be interdisciplinary, even if you're using small data. And, if you have access to big data, then you can use the big data mining tools to make predictions that are done by a computer. And therefore, it has no humans inborn biases, the algorithm itself, but they can be, they're all trained with our biases, right? They're all trained to reproduce our societal problems and biases. So don't trust an algorithm inherently, an interdisciplinary diverse.
Right, because the algorithm could have a bias built into it.
They all do.
It will.
They all do.
Yeah.
There's a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. It is a must read for anybody who works with data, and it's about the ways in which, just to give you an example, social inequality gets reproduced in the algorithms designed to help people, because if you feed it a data set to train it saying, guys named Brett make good CEOs, it's going to reject anyone who's not a guy named Brett for a CEO role, because those are the only CEOs the data has been able to include. So don't rely on an algorithm either. Rely on a bunch of different people who look at the problem from their own crazy separate ways. The crazier your team, the better it is at looking at the data and making accurate predictions. And by crazy, I mean
maybe a
weird
bunch of
thinking people.
Maybe like a bunch of different algorithms too. I mean, maybe, if it was an algorithm, you'd leverage different algorithms that would then triage that information. I mean, humans are algorithms, right? I mean, that's and functionally speak on some level, if I were to be completely reductive. I see confirmation bias everywhere. And I currently myself, I am running in the company that I work for, the research department and effort at the company I'm at. But I use mostly qualitative data. That's not to say I don't leverage quantitative data, but my emphasis is, just because I'm a talker and I like to engage with people, I use qualitative data. And I don't know if that's a 4-letter word in this room right now or not. And I just want to get your thoughts around that, the relationship between those two and how they inform each other.
You absolutely need to have qualitative data. There's stuff you cannot get out of quantitative data at all. And I think also it's completely wrong to see them as a binary. One of the things that I'm doing in my copious spare time, as my friends jokingly call it, is I'm going for my doctorate, and it's based on qualitative data of organizational behavior in education that I'm writing my dissertation on. And we do a thing that's called coding, and that's the manual process of basically taking qualitative data and finding quantitative ways of analyzing it by looking at the patterns. I won't go into too much detail here, but it's essentially the practice of looking at patterns in the data, assigning numbers to those patterns, and then using those numbers to make sense en masse of qualitative data. That's the manual way of doing it if you've talked to like 10 or 20 people. And then if you've got lots of qualitative data, like social media posts, then you can use natural language processing, which again gets us back to algorithms.
Well, I have I have my doctorate in educational leadership too, and qualitative research for
So
my dissertation. And the way the quant qual binary, I agree. It shouldn't be a binary. It should be a combination, because what the qualitative data fills in the gaps that you're not seeing in the quantitative data. The quantitative is going to give you some trends based on the numbers, but the qualitative is going to tell you the story behind those numbers, right?
exactly. Exactly.
And yeah, and then there's all that methodology around coding qualitative data. I know there's the positivist versus post-positivist binary too, right? Like the positivist is just like positivists will say the only data that matters is the statistical data. All other research is irrelevant. The post-positivist position is no, that the quantitative is only giving you a partial picture, maybe the forest, and the
Mhm.
qualitative is adding the trees. you know, so
Exactly.
you're getting a broader picture. To go back to that analogy.
Well, can I jump on this bandwagon? And I will also agree that I think that it is a false dichotomy. But I think it's a dichotomy that's forced or hoisted upon us. And I want to get you guys' take on this. In the sense, again, in my experience, when I'm talking to leadership about making decisions, they tend to lean towards the quant. They tend to
Mm-hmm.
look at it as if it's more valid. And so if I start talking about qualitative, it starts to get woo woo and their eyes glaze over. And it's like, well, that's what you think, kind of a feeling where it's like, well, there's actually methodologies to this qualitative stuff. But granted, there is room for error. And especially with probably some of the sample sizes that we're using. But I want to get your guys' take on, because I think it's just out of necessity to break them out to kind of move things through the system. But maybe I'm wrong.
Hmm. Well, I would
I would.
say, oh, go ahead. No, go for it.
Yeah, my initial reaction was that's probably another example of a bias toward quantitative data.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, that's my take. But am I alone in seeing that out there?
No.
No, no, I think we all see it. I would say one of the things that's helped me to overcome it with clients is to sit them down and talk about the methodologies. Talk about how this is based on real clean data collection, so genuine clean data collection, and also talk about, and this often alleviates people's concerns, talk about things like manual coding of data and talk about natural language processing. It's
Yep.
interesting how when you run qualitative data through an NLP program, suddenly it's like, it's the word from on high. Okay, there are no turtles holding up the planet because an algorithm parsed that data now. And I think that is, again, it's a bias, but you have to learn how to understand and anticipate people's biases. You're not necessarily going to be able to change it. So figure out a way to address that. And then in that aha moment of saying, oh, okay, there is an analytical aspect to qualitative data, I think the biases go away. So you sort of show and don't tell why that's an inaccurate bias.
Can I add one more thing to that in the opposite direction? So one of the things that I leveraged early on was trying to get leadership to see what we saw when we did our analysis, when we did our studies, was I'd actually record sessions. And at times it backfired because the opposite end also occurred in this is the danger of qualitative, I think, in general, and maybe even quant. But we would show some sort of extreme situation video. We'd record a session of
Yeah.
behavior using some sort of product, and then we'd share that with the leadership. And we were trying to definitely identify something, but the leadership would then glom onto that and take, which was slightly anecdotal yet informative in a signal, and then led with that and drove everything from that one picture. And I found that, wow, okay, you can go too far as well by showing certain people who are not necessarily studied or learned of the things that you need to know when you are trying to do this analysis, and they're in a leadership position. You can find yourself them answering weird questions that aren't really answered by the way that they've interpreted the data. And I haven't really, and that makes me sometimes not want to share it to some people, and just because it can kind of almost hurt me. And I wonder what your take is on that. What I'm saying, is that resonate at all? Does that make any
Oh, it
sense?
does. It absolutely does. And I think that so many organizations suffer from shiny object syndrome of, okay, this is it. This is what we're going to do. This worked. This worked. And so therefore I must do that. It's like, well, things worked out for this guy crossing the Alps with elephants. Let's get ourselves elephants. And you're standing there, you're like, no, this outlier situation is not something you should then be imitating, because most of the time, it's an outlier. Let's not glom on to this. I think that usually points to a broader problem with rational thinking and decision making. If somebody is so prone to looking at one or two data points and completely building an entire strategy on that, you have an organization that maybe at best has a move fast and break things mentality, which is fine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But then the only time such a situation is tenable is if people are okay with things getting broken. When it comes up to be a problem is when people say that they want to move fast and break things, but then when something breaks, they freak out.
Yeah.
I've seen that time and time again. Yep.
And
Absolutely.
so they still want to keep moving fast, but they don't want to live with the consequences of moving fast. And moving fast and breaking things only works if you break things. It is meant to be a cycle of feedback, and the breakage is the data, right? That's the lean startup methodology. So basically what they're saying is we don't really want to do lean. And I'm a Scrum master, and we joke around this all the time. A lot of people say, oh, we're doing Scrum and we're doing Agile, but really all they're doing is shipping code they haven't properly tested.
Yeah, we have a mantra here.
So
we have a mantra here called ABCD, which is always be collecting data. That's kind of something we say, on
the podcast. Yeah. So I want to, in our previous episode that we recorded earlier today, which is why Jodah and I are just still dressed the same for our audience. We use this analogy of my grandmother. So my grandmother.
I'm his grandmother.
Jodah's dressed up as my grandmother. And my grandmother's not going to understand what Scrum is. She's not going to understand what Agile or Lean is. So can we define those terms for our listeners who might be related to my grandmother or in the same age group?
Okay. Yeah, I could. I mean, I can't. I literally cannot.
Quickly, it doesn't have to be in depth.
Right. No. And my grandmother was a developer, so I but I think, and for me, it's always like, explain it to your neighbors. So Scrum is a methodology, and so is Agile, just really quickly, where you release work in short spurts of, you work on a feature of a product, you release it, and you try to, instead of building like one big thing that takes 18 months, you build it in pieces and release it as soon as some part of it is working. You can't do this when you're building a suspension bridge. But again, just to keep my analogy, because people will die. But for instance, you also aren't going to conquer the known world in like a week. You do it incrementally. You conquer, a territory. You rest for a while. You move along. You replenish your shields from Shields Are Us. Guaranteed.
Drink some ale.
Get some chainmail. Oh, chainmail had not been invented in ancient Greece. That
mithril. It'd be mithril, I think,
mithril.
Or is it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, they did not. They did not have chainmail. But that's an example of like, why didn't they have chainmail? Because nobody was doing Agile, and like inventing small pieces of chainmail and just adding on it. Okay, from there. So
adding more rings. Yeah.
Yeah, more rings. So basically, it's like you go step at a time, you evaluate the situation and you go step at a time, versus doing very high stakes product releases in lengthy time frames. And this is a gross oversimplification, but for the folks listening at home.
Yeah, it's a much more complex process with books on. There are whole books and manifestos on some of these concepts that we can't go into on this podcast.
There is a Scrum manifesto. That's how it got started.
So we can, if you're interested in that, go research it. Maybe we'll do an episode on that some other time. But I just want to make sure, like, case my grandmother, well, she's dead, so she's not listening, but maybe she's listening from heaven, who knows, that she would understand what we're talking about.
Well, let's talk about that a little more. No, just kidding. But I do want to bring up a notion of that. Then we are talking about Scrum, or not Scrum, but basically this software world of agility, of being able to produce things in small chunks, and then research. How do those two square off? So research and moving quickly, whether it's a software company, which typically it probably would be using Scrum, but I'm sure there are increasingly so in some of these companies that are leveraging contemporary and modern production capabilities like 3D printing and things, right? You could actually probably leverage Scrum in those kinds of facilities. How does research impact an environment like that? As opposed to, let's say, an old school company like a waterfall company where you had long-term strategy, you spent long terms of perhaps researching. What's changed? What's different? And how do you leverage these techniques and skills for that?
Oh, a lot has changed. So we practice agile marketing at my company that I founded in 2014, Thoughlight, and I speak about it in my most recent book, Marketing Metrics. So what's changed is you're constantly looking at the early data on what the results are from your campaigns. And that can be, just to talk about specific metrics, that could be leads that you've generated. It could be traffic you've generated, if that's something that's more important to your organization, although I seldom recommend that that be the primary metric, because traffic you don't have any guarantees around. It could be engagement rate, it could be sentiment, but you're constantly looking at that data. In the old days, what we would do is walk to school in the snow, uphill, both ways, with Wonder Bread bags on our feet. But what we would also do is we would release a campaign and we would wait long periods of time to find out whether it was actually generating any business for the organization. You don't need to wait to see if it's generating business in an agile environment, an agile marketing environment. You're going to see, is it generating early results like engagement, leads, click-through rate, web traffic. There's a bunch of different metrics you can be looking at, but those are some of the top ones. And based on those results, you're making adjustments. Now, the caveat is don't make adjustments literally constantly. Give things time to percolate, give things time to deliver results. It's going to vary by industry. B2B might take longer than B2C, but at the same time, absolutely be ready to make adjustments, and don't have any, don't get hung up on ego of saying, oh, my campaign is perfect, it can't be improved. Constantly be looking for those signals and adjusting accordingly, and that's how you win.
It's the null hypothesis, right, Dan? It's kind of in that spirit, right? Always
Yeah.
looking. I mean, the good way is thinking like, how is this not going to work? How is this? Where is it probably going to fail? And try to
Absolutely.
poke holes in
That's
your.
what you want to be doing.
Yeah. So I want to steer over to empathy in relation to this conversation. I hope that's not too abrupt, because I know we're making our way through this podcast. But because I know we want to talk about empathy and marketing within the context of all this. So, and this has been an ongoing theme within our podcast. The last couple episodes that we've done have been kind of centered around empathy in the .com space. So what does empathy look like in the marketing and data analytics space?
Well, I think it comes down to understanding your customers. And I know that you also were going to ask a little bit about, well, how do we use all of this data ethically? Obviously you want to
Yes.
apply to all of the applicable laws. You want to, adhere to all those laws. You want to apply your data in ways that don't violate people's privacy. But I think the other side of that ethics is you use the data to understand what your customers really want. It goes back to what's the right demographic lens to look at people through, and for what aspect of your marketing campaigns. Because, Joan of Arc being a French woman is completely irrelevant to her need for armor, but it's utterly relevant to the language you would use in an ad to target her. And so putting yourself in your customers' chainmail boots, not that those were a real thing,
Or
And
Wonder Bread bags,
your
right?
Wonder Bread bag, put yourself in your customer's Wonder Bread bag, and look at how can I understand what they need. A big part of that is customer journey mapping. I've put some material on my YouTube channel around customer journey mapping, which really takes that data and then helps you walk through, okay, if I were shopping for armor and I were a medieval peasant saving France, where would I first go? What would I do? And by the way, this also completely applies to whoever your customer is. You're taking that data, but you're making it into a three-dimensional path where you understand how your customer is interacting with not your brand. You're not doing it from a self-centered way. You're figuring out how your customer is taking steps to solve their problem.
Mm.
And that's what a customer journey map is all about. And that's how you make empathy core to your marketing.
So, like, say I have a problem, right? Like, all right, I need to have my deck replaced, and it's just true. I do need to have my deck replaced, and so that's my problem. I might go online, do some searches around decks, like deck repairs, do some comparisons around like types of decks I could buy, what the contractors would cost me, and those kind of things. And that data starts to accumulate around how I'm making my path to a particular product.
Pretty much, yeah. How do you make your path to the product? How do you understand what your options are? How do you make that final decision? That's
I'm cheap, so
the
I
key to
never make the
empathy.
decision.
It's true. It's true. He doesn't pay for a darn thing for this show. I pay for everything. What about dark empathy? Something I've heard of for the first time that Dan brought up in our last, 2 episodes ago. Then how do we forestall or stop that from happening? Because I think we can leverage these metrics to. So the last person, or we spoke to a gentleman who talked about companies and empathy, and companies need to be run by empathy. Like that is they need to move out of the space of sort of pure commerce in the sense that you're not trying to get people to buy things by any means necessary. You're trying to get people to engage with your product if they need it. And you're, as a company, are trying to find the way to make things or produce experiences that make it engaging to people. It's actually providing real value, right? Which will be derived from true empathy. But we also know that companies can be, I'm going to just sell stuff. And I think that's a trapping more so than a pathology, probably for most people. You get trapped into that behavior, but the metrics can probably facilitate that behavior as well. And I think I've seen that before. What are some telltale, or what are some methodologies to perhaps you could probably think about that could make sure something like this happen?
When I was younger and more optimistic, I would say that there are methods that you can put in place. But as I am the boss of more people and I develop more people who are able to more and more step into roles within my organization, I just get better at people management. I'm going to say you have to have good people in place. There is no way, if you have folks within your organization who think doing something ethically questionable, like exercising dark empathy, and I know what you mean. It's using data to manipulate people. It's using data to get people to act outside of accordance to their own best interest. It's gamification, for instance, is an excellent example in many cases of dark empathy because it makes people addicted to whatever it is, whatever the app is, whatever the platform is. There is literally no substitute for good human beings. And I wish there were, but the way to stop people from doing bad things is keep your organization safe from bad people. If you have a team that is willing to do anything to succeed. They're going to do it. And if you have a team that's working in the best interests of your customers, they're going to engage in healthy empathy. You have to hire right. That's it.
Yeah,
You
no, I
gotta
agree with
hire
that.
right.
And you have, and the unfortunate thing is there are a lot of people who think they're good actors and they're actually not, and they're maybe not even aware enough, or they're deluded. But that's a whole nother conversation. I do want to point out, like, I'm thinking of white hat empathy. I'm kind of maybe coining that term, but like with big data or with data analytics, because I think maybe we discussed this in the pre-interview, like, well, you could use this data to actually help someone like me who's looking for a deck, right? Like you spot in the trends, like, oh, there's some people looking for decks replacement, and I know how to get them the information they need that will convert them into buying this affordable deck, and the contractors that will come in and put it in safely, and the person's going to be pleased with the end product, and it's not going to break their bank and so forth.
Yeah.
Right? Is that a thing too?
Mm-hmm. No, it absolutely is. And that is white hat empathy. I mean, I don't like to use colors. I don't like to use white for good and black for bad. I call it good empathy. It's positive empathy. And that's the key. I mean, I would say empathy is one of the most powerful tools in the world. And that's what makes it so incredibly strong and powerful in whatever direction you choose to wield it in. It's, and I know we're kind of coming up against time, but going back to my history geekery, every single strategy Alexander the Great used to colonize the entire world, virtually all of them he got from the only previous ever completely undefeated Greek general, a gentleman by the name of Epaminondas, and pronounce that 3 times quickly. Epaminondas invented pretty much all of the infantry tactics you can imagine that existed before gunpowder was invented, that even Napoleon was still using after gunpowder was invented. But he used it to defeat Sparta and keep the world, or at least the ancient Greek world, safe for democracy for 40 years, set up an egalitarian society, and liberate the serfs that the Spartans had been holding. So all of those tactics, like column formations, this guy, whom history has sadly mostly forgotten at this point, he used for good. Somebody else comes along, and again, no knock on Alexander or his father Philip, and they take those same tactics and they use it to colonize the whole known world. The tactics were powerful. In the hands of a person whose heart was good and who wanted to help people, they were able to use that in historically significantly positive ways. You give that to somebody whose motivation is, I'm going to conquer the world, they're going to use it to conquer the world. The problem is not column formations. The problem is not empathy. The problem is not data. It's us as human beings. And that's why I both worry about AI and I don't worry about AI. Because AI is not sentient yet. It has no morals yet. So it's going to act amorally when you use it. And some human being either has to control it morally or they have to control it to some end, which is maybe morally gray or maybe self-serving or maybe something that, as you mentioned, for many generations, we were taught that the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire were good because they spread our European culture to all these other people who didn't have it. Now we wake up and realize, well, wait a minute, they had their own civilization. But colonialism was seen as a benefit to these folks who, oh, look, we're going to give them our European civilization. They didn't think they were villains. And that, again, there's no solution for that. But the tactics are only as good or bad as the moral agent, which is at this point still a human being, deploying them. And even there, people have different definitions of what's good or bad. So the more powerful the tactic, the more you really have to be careful of who you're hiring and what your company's values are and what the company's mission is. Because that's the only thing standing
Nice.
between us and destructive behavior.
Agreed.
So yeah, we are coming toward the end. We had hoped to ask you quickly about blockchain, but that's probably too much. We might have to have you back to talk about that.
That's a whole other thing. Yeah. And in fact, maybe we can actually do that as a panel with our previous gentleman. I'd be curious.
Yeah. But what are the key? At the end of episodes, we like to ask the guests, based on this whole conversation that we've had so far today, what do you think the key takeaways for the audience should be?
You know, I walked into this interview, sat down in my hovel to this interview with my pets and my yarn, thinking that this was going to be about how to be smart with data. And now we've had a conversation about colonialism, AI, ethics, our own moral, blind spots. And so I'm going to say, actually, the lesson is very different. And the lesson is the tools that we have are more powerful than ever before. And that means that we need to be smarter about using them than ever before. Gone are the days when I got started in analytics where, it's really cool to know who's reading what articles, how many times, and for how long. We now have the ability to make things either much better or much worse with powerful data tools for our stakeholders. And if you read Weapons of Mass Destruction or some of the other great books on it, Data Feminism is another one, we can cause significant harm to society, which, again, as advertising people, you should have never trusted us with this. We are not capable, frankly, of finding our keys on most days, speaking for myself. And yet, here we are able to sway elections. And so you need to double up on your sense of what's right and wrong, what your organization should be doing and should not be doing, because the tools are there to create either wonderful good or wonderfully terrible outcomes. Not wonderfully in a good way, horribly terrible outcomes. So get back to your values.
Yeah, and I'm almost wondering if there's also a subtext. Hey, people out there, get yourself some understanding of what data analytics is. Like, start to try to understand statistics, trends, systems thinking, things like that, so that because the world's is really complex, and you are being played a lot out there, and you got to try to recognize that you're being, you are being manipulated. Good, bad, doesn't matter, and understanding how
it's a type of literacy. Really,
it's a literacy, yeah.
Type of literacy,
and most people are not that literate about that stuff, understandably so, Exactly. Well, Christina, hey, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a delight.
Yes, this was a real pleasure. I learned a lot, and I love that we went all over the place. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about Rasputin, but next time.
I got nothing on Rasputin. I'm really more of an ancient history person, but I hope I left you with some food for thought, and I'll even put some history readings in my resources if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
That would be awesome.
I appreciate that. So thank you so much. And
folks, make sure to hit the like, subscribe, all those buttons on wherever you're listening. Just hit the buttons and keep hitting them.
Yeah, don't stop.
And buy my book.
And buy our book. We'll put a link.
Buy Christina's book. I read it. It's great.
Yeah, we'll put a link in.
I'm still reading it because there's a lot of good material in there, and lots of tools and resources.
Yep.
It's interactive.
All right, everybody. Bye.
Bye.